Chapter 9. Guilt. I have so much. The weight is too much to bear. I feel it crushing me from all directions. The fear of what I've done is eating me alive. I can take away the guilt and fear. You'll never have those feelings ever again. But at what cost? Only your soul. Rod rises up from the shroud of sleep in a cold sweat. He pants heavily and grips his chest in pain. As he feels the bandages, Rod looks down and tries to process his last thoughts. Another sharp pang attacks his battered body, this time originating near his temple. His other hand instinctively goes to the head as he tries to rub the ache out. A moment later, the throbbing subsides enough for him to shake the rest of the uneasy drowsiness from his eyes. His place of slumber is dark, yet comforting. He scoots over to the edge of the bed and eases to his feet, a little shaky at first. He braces himself against the wall. A familiar smell of swine and dough plug his senses. Rod knows exactly where he is now as he cautiously heads to the ladder leading to the bottom level of Rin's cabin. Coming closer to the rectangular hole, he hears voices. Judging from the higher pitch of one, Rod recognizes it to be Rebecca. It sounds as though she is arguing with several people. He grabs hold of the ladder and descends to the bottom floor. The aroma of pig and bread is more prominent at ground level. The voices are clearer as Rod moves to the front door. Rebecca's tone is stern and concise. "Where do you think you're going with those guns?" A defiant male voice responds quickly. "Papa and Enya are still out there. They need our help. I made a promise to your father to not follow after and put you boys into any risk. You're much too young to face the evils that are inane," Rebecca responds. Rod opens the door as Rebecca stands on the edge with her arms crossed, scrutinizing the two boys, both armed to the teeth with an assortment of weapons from the basement. Turin stands behind Dean, cowering before the cold stare of his mother. His long brown hair is tied back, revealing his youthful face. He's wearing one of his father's brown jackets, which ends right above his knees, with the sleeves rolled back. His brother, a few years older, is a head or two taller. His hair is also tied back, but braided. He spent the last year or so letting his beard grow out like his father. The straps of a sword sheath press over his patched leather jacket. A pistol rests on his right hip while he holds a shotgun. Though his eyes are brown, they deepen with a fiery determination to save his family. Rod can see this and decides to limp out in objection. "I'll go." All three go silent, and Rebecca turns to face the injured hunter. The boys stand there tight-lipped until Dean bursts out into an abrupt laugh. "What can you do? You're as limp as a dying dog." "Turn, go to my motorcycle, and fetch a small leather pouch from the left saddlebag for me," Rod directs. The young boy stands there motionless until his mother barks at the boy to do as he's told. He nastily nods to her and takes off to the barn. Rod walks over to a rocking chair on the porch and eases into it. The old mother walks over and loosens the bandages on his chest. "Let's take a look at your wounds." She unravels them and places her hand on the incision, applying a bit of pressure to confirm the stitches are still holding. To her surprise, the skin is healing rapidly. Rebecca adds a little more pressure, and Rod gasps slightly. She surveys his face for an instant, then smiles. "The stitches are holding up nicely. Luckily, no infection is forming. What happened out there?" "A demon. It's been pursuing me for several days. I was lucky enough to have kindling for a campfire at night with devilweed." "From what the boys tell me, it must have been huge," Rebecca says. "The largest I've seen." "The boys said there was no body. Maybe it got away?" Rebecca asks. Rod stays silent. She sees his eyes linger into deep thought. She remains quiet as she wraps the bandages back around Rod's chest. Standing up, the worried mother heads into the house, but not before turning back to him. They also told me your sword was stuck in a tree trunk. Dean wasn't able to pull it out. I figure you may need it when you travel to Ain. Thank you, Hunter, for all that you are doing for my family. The words soften Rod's heart for a moment as he looks up to see her looking warmly at him. He smiles back and nods. As she closes the screen door, that old feeling of resolve sinks into the pit of his stomach. He fights against the pain and gets to his feet. As he makes his way down the steps, Rod is greeted by Tern holding out the leather pouch. He hands it to the hunter, who graciously accepts it. He unravels the leather strap, pinches off a little bit of the dark green grass from the top of the pouch, and puts it in his mouth. His face shrivels up as the sour grass ransacks his taste buds. Tern lets out a little chuckle from Rod's expression. Rod builds up enough saliva and harshly swallows the ground herb. What is that? Dried tar lilies. It helps with the pain. The boy looks at him inquisitively. He's never heard of tar lilies, and Rod isn't about to go into specifics. The hunter begins his slow trek to the barn. Tern follows him quietly. Each step is a slight improvement over the last. As the tar lilies break down and travel through the bloodstream, Rod's performance improves and his stride quickens. The lilies dull the pain, allowing his body to repair in overdrive without feeling any negative side effects. Rod and his small shadow arrive at the barn, with Tern in complete shock at how rapidly the herbs work. Rod smiles at the young boy. There are side effects, however. The boy questions with ignorant eyes. Rod waves a hand behind his back, insinuating bad gas. Tern snickers, then busts out into a full-out laugh. Dean emerges from the back of the barn, carrying Rod's leather belt with his pistols. What's so funny? Rod and Tern look at each other with sly grins. The hunter winks at the boy, who covers his mouth with both hands to mask the next laugh. He replies to Dean while walking over to Stacy. Nothing. Rod's remaining supplies and clothing lay across the motorcycle's saddle. With little hesitation, he slips his clothes on. Dean hands the gun belt to the hunter. Rod thanks him and slings it around his waist. You really think you can do this? I saw the state you were in last night. You shouldn't be alive. His words are cold as ice as he stares at Rod. The malice toward the hunter is only a mask for fear of his father and sister's fate, and anxiety at the possibility of having to pick up the mantle as head of the household. I will bring them back. I promise. Rod extends his hand to Dean, and they shake. Rod feels the tremble of terror in the young man's grip, which fuels his purpose even more. He turns back to Stacy and flings his dark leather jacket on. As he straddles the motorcycle, Rebecca enters the barn carrying a roll with last night's meat stuffed inside. She hands it to Rod, and he devours it in several bites. He says his thanks and turns Stacy to the barn entrance, igniting the Metal Beauty's engine, and takes off in the same direction as last night. Rod speeds through the extinct forest. His reflexes are at tip-top shape by this point, and he weaves through the woods with deadly precision. The sun makes his journey much easier this time as he spots a trail to the left. Turning the bike, the rider zooms toward the path, then downshifts as he slides right into it. He accelerates again as the bike aligns itself to the route. The trail has a slight incline, but is much more manageable on a bike than on foot. He hits the peak and flies into the air several feet before landing back on the ground. The path descends into the ravine where he fought last night. Looks like a bomb went off, he thinks, looking at the rubble scattered about in a 20-yard radius. Several trunks are still embedded into the ground like harpoons. Rod stops in the center of the blast range and looks around. He sees his sword still planted in the massive trunk. Rod hops off the bike and walks over to it. "What did you do?" Rod asks the Dark One. No response comes from the voice. "Fine. Keep your secrets." He grabs the hilt of the sword and pulls it from the trunk, meanwhile looking down at the ground and trying to find any clue that would trigger a memory. Nothing. He retracts the blade and sheaths it. Hopping back onto the motorcycle, Rod continues the drive to Ain. 30 minutes or so pass before he breaks through the forest's fossilized clutches, coming out to a wide, barren plateau. About a mile or so away, he can see rolling hills flowing up and down to the horizon. He scans the skyline. To the east, he sees a community of thin black smoke plumes skulking upward. Figuring the smoke is from the chimneys, the rider peels off in that direction. He races over several hills before sliding down into a small valley. Some old pines clutter the vicinity with several clans of bushes. Turning eastward to the smoke, Rod catches faint tracks in the dirt. There are sets of normal-sized feet, probably from the villagers. Above them is a pair with a deeper indentation, much wider and an inch longer. Must be Rin's. He accelerates and heads to a winding path up the mountain toward the smoke. He comes across the first turn left. The path becomes very narrow. 15 yards and he cuts right. The path weaves all the way to the village. Ain is a tiny community nestled at the end of the mountain range, built on a wide plateau overlooking the valley below. It gives the residents a nice view and allows them to spot invaders on their way to the village. A wall of oak trees surrounds the perimeter, taken from the neighboring forest. This gives the inhabitants a choke point if intruders ever try to storm the settlement. Even so, most of the denizens are farmers and have zero combat training. The buildings are constructed from oak trees in a circle. A concrete well sits at the center. A makeshift saloon and inn are the first building travelers come to. No other commerce. The people donate all goods and commodities to the church, which they, in turn, disperse among all citizens. Any extra goods are traded with traveling merchants. Tucked in the back is a wooden staircase that leads to the church, which overlooks the village as a towering reminder of who controls Ain. Rod reaches the village entrance. He creeps in and parks by the saloon. The village circle is unnervingly vacant, not a single person in sight. All the doors and windows of each building are closed. Turning the bike off, he makes his way inside the tavern. It's a very medieval-looking saloon with empty wooden tables and chairs distributed about. The crackling of logs in the fireplace fills the air of the vacant tavern. Straight ahead, Rod spots the bar. A blonde woman stands behind it, cleaning some dishware. He walks over to take a seat. The barmaid finishes drying off a wooden mug and looks up at the tiresome traveler. "Afternoon, stranger. What can I get for you?" she asks with an awkward smile. "I'll take some water." She leans closer to Rod and whispers, "Don't drink the water." The light-skinned barmaid stares at him genuinely in hopes he gets the hint. He studies her face. Her blue eyes are hiding a secret, but not from him. Something is truly troubling here, but Rod doesn't quite understand why. The barmaid takes her long blonde hair and throws it in a bun as she turns to the bottles of alcohol behind her. She grabs a worn jar and a small glass. Twirling around, the woman sets the glass down and fills it to the top with the brown liquid from the jar. During her process, Rod pulls one of his guns from the holster, slides the magazine out, and drops one of the bullets on the table as payment for the drink. Each nods in thanks. The barmaid places the bullet in her gray apron, and Rod downs the liquor in one gulp and turns the glass over. Rod glances around the empty bar and back to the blue-eyed host. "Where's everyone?" She leans back while continuing to clean the mugs. "At the church. That's where they are every day this hour." I'm looking for a burly, bearded fellow. Goes by Rin. She stops her chore. The tavern host leans closer again, her voice trembling this time. They took his daughter to the church early this morning. A short time later, he came to the village, screaming for Father Thomas to come out. They are going to sacrifice her. They believe in sacrificing the purity of a child will grant them salvation from the plague. He thanks her and heads out of the saloon. He exits the saloon and sees several villagers shrouded in dark robes running to the far end of the village. He follows, hugging the buildings as he shortens the gap between him and the group, constantly checking his surroundings for an ambush as he sneaks past each wooden building. Rod makes his way to the staircase that leads to the church. He sneaks over to the first step and looks up. The branches from the surrounding trees form a web-like tunnel overhead. His eyes follow the trail until he finds the robed figures moving up the rocky steps. One looks back in time to spot Rod. They hasten their speed. He looks behind, scans the village one last time, then gives chase. The branches unnervingly sway back and forth as he climbs the stairs. Whispers travel on the back of each gust of wind, as if the trees are giving away his position. The hunter gets the sense of eyes watching him from within the forest. Childlike giggles whisper behind him, then resonate all around. Halfway up, Rod sees the end of the steps. He looks out to the left, where there's a small break from the wall of branches and leaves. He's taken aback by the beautiful vista stretched out before him. I didn't realize how high up this place is. From this altitude, the oak trees below are little blurry patches. Broad strokes of different hues of green smear over the barren canvas. The eastern mountain range continues to the horizon, eventually vanishing in the dusty haze. Ancient structures sprawl about below and beyond. Past the northwestern skyline begins the desert Damnum. It's a massive desert that stretches out for what seems like an eternity. He must make that journey soon if he's to reach Orgrimdir for the tournament. The demon hunter, however, must finish the task at hand. He continues the ascent. Reaching the top, he pauses to catch his breath. Before him stands an old Gothic church, originally built with bricks. Time, of course, was not kind. Erosion has eaten away the majority of the church's outer defenses. Lumber from the surrounding trees has been used to patch a fallen wall. The old bricks still lay on the ground, slowly being consumed by nature. Hundreds of vines track up the building, constricting the half-broken cross at the top. Low chanting emanates from the church. The hymn grows louder as Rod creeps toward the double doors. He slows his breathing and brings his heart rate down, visualizing the contents on the other side. Many patrons fill the church. The vibration from their voices gives him a rough layout. 40 patrons by his count and equally divided on either side. The chanting stops. Silence falls like a heavy hammer. The trees cease all movement in a foreshadowing fear of what's to come. The only sound is the disciplined thump of Rod's heart. He grips his left hand around the knob of the old wooden door, pulling it open. It creaks as the wood scrapes across the ground. He walks into the dark void of the church. It takes a second for his eyes to adjust to the candlelit room. Rod's assumption is correct, as he spots 20 patrons sitting on pews on either side. They all have their hands clasped together and heads low in prayer. Each figure is veiled in dark robes. Torches line the columns on either side as an illuminating guide to a stone altar. To the right of the waist-high altar stands Father Thomas. Enya is resting across the stone slab, lifeless and wrapped in a white linen cloth. Her hands are bound together in prayer. Above the father to his left hangs Rin, fastened to an oak crucifix. The old tinker's hands and feet are bound with rope. He's gagged and unconscious. The priest of Ain is standing still, gawking over his coveted tome. Rod takes a step forward. Father Thomas snaps his head up, smiling at the visitor with a bizarre grin. "Welcome, my lost lamb. Please, won't you come in?" Father Thomas says, motioning with his right hand. "You are just in time for the divine sacrifice of this pure child. Only through this martyrdom will she find eternal peace while laying with God. Only then will she save our dark souls from the plague that damned us." Whimpers and moans from the patrons fill the church as Rod walks closer to the altar. Whispers begging for release. Cries of fear and damnation emit from his left. Voices begging for eternal life to his right. He stops 10 feet from Father Thomas, sensing tormented beings lurking, watching his every movement from within the shadows around the altar. "Let them go," Rod demands. Father Thomas lets out a slight chuckle, moving his arms outward. "I am afraid I can't do that, my child. This is the only way to save these people." He takes a step forward, allowing his narrow face to be clearly seen. He's draped in a black robe with a wooden cross attached to a string of beads fastened around his thin neck. Clutching the tome in his left hand, the father continues his sermon. "The archangels came to me in a divine dream, told me the location of this sacred scripture. When I found it, everything became so clear, the voice of our benevolent God searing into my mind. I knew then that I could save my flock." Rod bows his head slightly, then speaks to the father in a solemn tone. "Then I, too, wish to join your flock, for my soul is tainted, and only your divine wisdom can cleanse it." "Then come to me, my son, and kneel before God's shrine, so I can bless you into our flock." The hunter walks closer to the altar, positioning his left hand toward his back. Without drawing too much attention, Rod slides his hand into a pouch on his belt. He responds to the father as passively as possible, doing his best to draw him off guard. "Before I join, Father, I have something I need to show you." Father Thomas places his right hand on Rod's shoulder, still grinning with a devilish smile. "Anything, my child?" The father's breathing increases to an odd pant, like a dog growing anxious for food. From a pouch, Rod produces a small, compact mirror and brings it up to the father's face. Upon seeing his reflection, Father Thomas shrieks and staggers back. He drops the tome, covering his face with both hands. His wild shrieks pierce throughout the church. He drops to his knees in pain and vanishes behind the stone altar. The howls subside. The church goes silent for several seconds. 2 long, scaly hands crawl out of the darkness, moving over the top of the slab. Father Thomas's fingers grow in length as he uses the altar as a crutch. Rod sees his body contorting through the dark robes. His head, once full of thick, gray hair, is now bald. Father Thomas takes several steps toward Rod. The mimic laughs wildly. His face is very narrow, with dark green eyes and a long nose curving downward. The mimic's spine curls like a question mark as it slouches over, its gangly arms outstretched. "How did you know, my darling?" The mimic hisses as it speaks. Rod points to his eye while lecturing the gnarly creature. "You don't match the eye color of whoever you impersonate. What I don't understand, though, is how you lured him. Care to elaborate?" The mimic chuckles with an eerie wink. "I never give away my secrets, dearie. Children, finish this piece of shit so we can continue the service. I have this beautiful girl I must indulge myself in. The lanky mimic touches Enya's foot and licks its lips with a purplish tongue. The creature hesitates for a moment. The mimic wants to take its time with this one, this young, beautiful girl. The master will have to wait, the creature whispers with a gurgle in its throat. For now, Father Thomas holds temptation until Rod is properly dealt with. Rod turns to the front of the church as the congregation advance sluggishly to their prey. Robed men appear from the shadows around the encircled hunter. Rod awakens his guns, firing in rapid succession, every shot hitting a worshipper in their vital organs. As the bullets rip flesh and tear tissue, the congregants fall to the ground without making the slightest noise. They move like lifeless automatons. Each one he shoots down is simply replaced with another. Before the next onslaught, Rod reloads each pistol with a full magazine. A congregant leaps at him from the left. The hunter sidesteps, waits for the attacker to pass, then puts a bullet in the back of her head. He hears muffled noises and looks up to see that Rin is awake and trying to loosen his bindings. Rod fires at one of the chains securing Rin, then another. A worshipper grabs the hunter from behind. Rod elbows the man in the ribs. He loosens his grasp just enough for Rod to fire off 2 shots to the worshipper's chest. He drops to the ground as Rod fires 2 more shots at the chain. It breaks. The second snaps near the ceiling from the weight of both Rin and the crucifix. The oak cross shatters into several pieces. Rin grunts as he meets the ground. The old tinker staggers to his feet. He peers at the group coming toward him, and adrenaline ignites through his body. Rin grabs a piece of the crucifix and throws it like a javelin, piercing one of the worshippers. He grabs another and slings it, then another. Rin charges at the remaining attackers, knocking them back but pinning one against a stone column. Rin drives his thumbs into the congregant's eyes. He squeezes until the eyes squeeze out of the sockets like mush. The congregant says nothing. No cries of pain, just a muzzled moan, as if his mouth is covered by some unseen force. Rin continues to squeeze until the congregants draw his last breath. He takes the body and flings it into the remaining men and women he knocked to the ground. Rod concentrates on the worshippers around the perimeter. He dashes at 2 of the figures while reaching for his sword, then thrusts the blade into one of the men and sidekicks the other against the wall. 3 of the worshippers take hold of Enya and carry her over to the mimic standing in the corner. Pulling on a chain, the bony demon reveals a false door. Father Thomas makes eye contact with Rod, then waves as he, along with the worshippers carrying Enya, enter the secret passage. The wall closes behind them. At that moment, one of the congregants grabs Rod from behind, wrapping his arms around Rod's chest. Another comes at him from the right. He stabs the oncoming assailant, releasing his sword. Rod brings both arms over his head, grabbing the back of the worshipper's neck. With a firm grasp, he falls to the floor, and his shoulder crashes up into the patron's neck, snapping it. He rolls the body over, gets back to his feet, and then checks on Rin, who is holding the last worshipper by the neck. Rin squeezes with both hands until he hears his neck snap, then slams the body to the ground. Rod calls out, "Nice work," pulling the sword from the corpse. Rin looks over with a big thumbs up. His eyes trek over to the altar, only to find his daughter missing. "Enya!" Rin yells, running over to the stone bed. "There's a false door in the corner," Rod shouts, pointing with his sword. Rin makes his way over, grabs the chain, and pulls it down. A cool, thick breeze hits the 2 men as the door swings open. "Judging from the smell, I bet the sacrificial corpses are down there." Rod takes a step back from the foul stench, but Rin stays resolute and charges forward. With sword in hand, Rod follows close behind. The stairs spiral downward. Small torches are lit all the way, just giving enough light to see the oncoming step. They round the last turn and enter a large cavern. Beams of light project across the spacious cave from above. Bluish-green moss dresses the walls. The men take several steps forward when a large pool of water to their right comes into view. "This must be where they get their drinking water," Rod says, walking over to the pool and kneeling down. He cups his hand and brings a handful up to his lips. He stops suddenly and lets the water fall back to the pool. The smell of the water reminds him of the warning from the barmaid. He looks over to the old tinker, who is about to partake in a cool, refreshing drink. "Don't drink the water." His warning goes unnoticed as Rin brings the water to his lips. As soon as his lips touch the liquid, Rin pushes his hands away, coughing in disgust. "What is that?" "Demon vomit," answers the hunter, watching the flow of water. "There's a demon here poisoning the drinking water." "Why would it do that?" Rod looks at the pool of water in deep thought. What does it all mean? He mulls over everything that transpired in the past 24 hours. The dream, the tome, the water. The dream. An epiphany strikes him. "You said Father Thomas had a dream about the tome, correct?" "Aye." "Mimics can't enter the minds of mortals." The hunter's eyes are in a maddening lock with Rin's. The time-worn tinker is thumbing through the pages of his own mind, looking for the same answer Rod unearthed. The thought strikes his mind like an iron hammer shattering a bell. His eyes widen. "Son of a bitch! The mimic is working with an incubus. But why would they work together?" "I don't know. They don't need each other to survive. An incubus will lure you to them through dreams, then drain your life force, eating you raw. A mimic is a sexual deviant. They will fuck anything but don't eat mortals. They're bottom feeders. Shit and bugs are their things." "That's sadistic," Rin disgusted. "Come on, let's find your daughter." Rin runs back to the staircase, grabbing a torch and taking the center passage through the cavern. He stays ahead, lighting the way. The tunnel winds deep into the darkness. The only sound is of running water, which is still moving along to their right. Rin points ahead of the tunnel opening to another large cavern. They can hear the mimic yelling at someone or something. Rod whispers to Rin to put the torch out. The two men sneak to the opening. Coming to the edge, they notice a path to their left, leading down to the open pit. The mimic, along with the remaining patrons and Enya, is standing near a wide-open pool. Light reflecting off the water dances along the cavern walls. A small oval of light shines down on the pool in front of the mimic. Rod points to it and whispers to the old tinker, "I think that's the well." "So the incubus must be here somewhere?" Rin asks with a whisper. Rod nods, gesturing for them to follow the path down. As the duo make their way to the pool, they begin to understand the one-sided conversation below. The mimic yells into the abyss. Its gnarly tone is frightened and angry. The creature cries out to the shaded pool, "We must make our escape, master. The mortals will be here any minute." Hunched over, the frail demon walks over to the girl, who thankfully has been unconscious through the entire ordeal. Stroking her hair, the bottom-dwelling creature drools at its last morsel of pleasure. "But first, I need to plant a nice seed in her." He moans and sniffs her body. Puddles of drool drench the linen wrappings. A deep, thunderous voice bursts throughout the cavern, startling the deviant demon. "You fool! They are here!" The mimic looks over to the path and yells back to the cool darkness. "I don't see anything. They will be properly dealt with, master. I have complete faith in my flock." The cavern rumbles as the voice interjects. "I've sensed an odd aura for some time. Ever since you returned with this girl, I've felt it draw closer. As we speak, it closes in on us. You've led them right to us." The incubus is correct, but their conversation has allowed Rod and Rin to sneak up behind the mimic. Rod quietly runs up to the closer worshipper, driving his sword through his back and out his chest. The mimic squeals in terror as Rin emerges from darkness in a full charge. The bug-eyed creature tries to run but trips over himself. As the mimic tries to claw back to his feet, Rin grabs him by the ankle. In an effortless motion, the protective father slides the mimic closer to him. Rin grasps the mimic by the neck, then lifts it overhead while Rod makes quick work of the remaining worshippers. The hunter looks on as Rin chokes the gangly demon, but his focus shifts to the massive red orbs in the shadowy abyss of the spring. He calls out to the tinker, who is too enraged with bloodlust to notice the orbs floating near. "Rin, forget about the mimic and just grab Enya." Rod's words sever the blind rage for an instant, and Rin replies, "Why?" A red muscle whips out and wraps around Rin's left arm, and he yells, loosening his death grip on the mimic. A massive face appears out of the shadows. A huge mouth with millions of teeth smiles at the two men. The muscle wrapped around Rin's arm is one of the incubus tongues with acidic saliva that burns the gruff tinker's skin. Rod pulls a small round ball with a wick from one of his pouches. Grabbing his lighter, he lights the ball and hurls it at the incubus. The grenade explodes, filling the cavern with deep green light, momentarily unveiling the corpulent incubus. The face resembles that of a toad, with gray, scaly skin. Its huge, fatty arms work to keep its head out of the water. The tongue lets go and slithers back into its mouth. The flash leaves the incubus blinded for an instant, giving the hunter enough time to reach his friend and help him to his feet. "Can you carry Enya to the top of the ramp?" Rod asks. Rin pushes all the pain deep within himself, looking at Rod with a nod. The wounded father picks up his sleeping daughter and runs to the ramp as fast as he can. Something grabs Rod's ankles, pulling his feet out from under him, then sending him upwards. Hanging upside down, he unleashes his pistols and fires several shots at the demon's face. Another tongue lashes out and attaches to Rod's left hand. The saliva burns Rod's hand like acid, releasing his grip on his 1911. He winces in pain and holsters the other pistol. Reaching around and unsheathing the sword, he swings at the tongue latched around his arm and slices through the appendage, then swipes the one around his leg. Rod swiftly turns his body as he falls to land on his feet, then into a roll. The incubus stomps after the hunter. The demon hunter unsheaths his sword as the incubus sends multiple tongues at its stubborn prey. In rapid succession, he dodges and swings at the assault, carving the tongues with precision accuracy as they get too close. He cuts two incoming from his right, then quickly pulls out his pistol and fires off 2 shots at the incubus face. It screams as the bullets pierce its flesh. A pus-like substance oozes out of the wounds. The demon, growing furious, pushes its arms forward toward Rod. The cavern shakes with each palm slamming into the ground. Pieces of stalactites crash into the pool. Rod backtracks, firing at the demon, then parrying the onslaught of tongues. A sharp pain erupts from his chest, and he realizes that the effects of the tar lilies are wearing off. Again, the Dark One comes calling. "No pain, no more suffering. I will handle this. You just have to let go." Rod can hear the dark lullaby resonating through his mind. Yes, if he gives in, all pain subsides for a brief time, and he'll have the power to stop the incubus. But what is the cost? He can feel bits of himself chip away each time the Dark One is released. He's losing himself to the void of his consciousness. This demon, this manifestation of something else, these questions haunt him daily. No, not now. Rod has to push the pain away and face this demon on his own. Damn it, not now. His chest burns from last night's ordeal with the behemoth. It's too late. Rod can't hold off the Dark One. The incubus sees Rod hesitate and takes advantage of the situation. The demon lifts its right hand and smacks it against Rod, knocking him off his feet. Rod gives in to the Dark One before hitting the ground. On impact, he rolls backward, pushing off the ground and planting with both feet. His eyes turn milky white once more. He takes off toward the demon. Its left hand slams toward the ground. Rod dodges and jumps onto the hand. No more pain. Rod moves with uncanny agility, as if the laws of gravity do not apply to him. He climbs up the incubus arm, slicing all infringing tongues. The incubus moves its right hand toward the haunted enemy as he reaches the shoulder. Rod leaps into the air, both hands gripping the hilt overhead toward the left eye, and drives the blade into the blood-red eyeball. It pops. Fluid and gooey bits rupture from the puncture. The incubus falls to its side with a screech that echoes throughout the cavern. Rod drops to the ground and steps back in a defensive stance. Holding its wounded eye, the incubus lies on the ground motionless for a moment before the mouth opens up, revealing a blue light. A transparent being with a blue hue emerges from the corpulent shell. The arteries and blood vessels are seen branching throughout the body. The demon walks gently to Rod, as to not come off as threatening. The creature knows it's been bested. The only chance now is to strike a deal for its life. The being gestures a sign of truce, moving its head as if to speak. Rod walks over and thrusts his fist into the transparent creature's chest, clutching its beating heart, and squeezes. The heart bursts, and the blue spirit's body oozes and fades to liquid smoke, like the behemoth in the petrified forest. Rod reclaims consciousness in time to see the demon fade out of existence. "The deed is done. No need to thank me," says the dark voice as it slithers deep into Rod's mind. The hunter would not have lasted as long as he has in this world if it wasn't for the Dark One. This dark gift. He wishes to be rid of it, but holds on to it like a drug. "If only I could remember," Rod says, shaking the haze from his eyes. The throbbing pain returns as he clenches his chest. The battle is over, and the demons are dead. Rod breathes a sigh of painful relief. He spots the handle of his 1911 next to the shore. He walks over and picks it up. He frowns at the mangled sight of the gun. "No repairing that. Shit." He tosses the deformed pistol into the lake and turns back to the incline. Rin and Enya are at the top. He channels all his energy away from the thought of pain and is able to find his composure before greeting Rin with an exhausted wave. The gruff tinker pats his fatigued companion square on the back. "I owe you my life." Rod modestly shrugs it off. "Glad I could help." Enya rouses from slumber. The two men unravel her linen confines and help the sleepy child to her feet. Ecstatically, she hugs both men, thanking them over and over. The men smile, both with the solemn reply, "It was nothing." The trio begins their trek out of the cavern, back to the church. Enya asks about the events taking place while she was asleep. Rod could only surmise that the incubus, being a glutton by nature, ate itself into a sedentary state. Incubi lure humans by entering and manipulating their dreams. Looks as though Father Thomas was the last human in its telepathic radius. When and how the mimic came into play, the hunter wasn't quite sure. At some point, though, they made a pact with each other. The mimic would take the place of the father, bringing humans to the cavern as a sacrifice. In turn, the mimic, the sexual deviants that they are, would get to tenderize the meat, so to speak. Rod does his best to keep the graphic detail to a minimum in front of Enya. Rin stops and probes the hunter. "So what about the tome, and the eyes for that matter? What is the significance of the eyes?" Rod considers both questions to himself before answering. "Well, the incubus contaminated the drinking water, giving a viable story to lure Father Thomas away from the village, giving the mimic the opportunity to kill him and take on his guise. The tome could just be a manifestation conjured by the incubus. As for your second question," Rod continues, "it has no spark." "Spark?" Rin asks with a confused expression. "I don't quite follow." I've always had a theory, more of a hunch, I guess you would say. Every living thing in this world has an aura about it. Some have called it a soul, a consciousness of yourself, your true self. When you die, your body will rot and return to the earth, but your soul or spark lives on.
So demons don't have a spark?
Enya interjects. Not necessarily saying that. I think some things, human or otherwise, can exist in this world without that spark, and you can usually see it in their eyes. It's the eyes that always give it away. When you look at someone that doesn't have that spark, it's as if something is missing. Their aura isn't quite right.
And you think these mimics are that type of creature? That they do not have a soul or spark?
Enya asks, looking down into a pool of cavern water. She stares into her reflection, focusing on her eyes in hopes of seeing this spark Rod speaks of. Yes, I do. And if they have no spark, how can they ever mimic it? To project an image of someone with that spark if they don't have it themselves. Rin pauses. He lets out a sharp scoff. When you say it like that, you can't help but pity the little bastard. And maybe that's just it, Rod explains. Or just me trying to find a purpose in these entities' lives. There must be a reason for their existence. I don't believe in happen-chance or coincidences. There is a reason for everything. Or not, Rin interjects. Rod stops to look at the old tinker. It's a grand and noble gesture to think everything has some divine reason to be here, but sometimes I think shit happens. We deal with it and then move on. It makes you dwell too much on the past. It may just consume you in the process. They continue through the torchlit tunnel, with Rod taking the lead. Enya follows close behind, with Rin keeping a watchful eye at their flank. I need to see the tome for myself to see if it is indeed a divine artifact, Rod says. They make it back to the church, where dismembered bodies still clutter the floor, and the blood has started to dry and stick. Rin tells Enya to wait outside while they look for Father Thomas's prized possession. After searching for half an hour, the men conclude that it was just a manifestation of the incubus, and meet up with Enya to make their descent through the wooded tunnel. Upon arrival at the town, the exhausted travelers check several of the buildings for any citizens. No one could be found. Rod remembers speaking with the barmaid when he first arrived. He walks over and pushes through the swinging saloon doors. Empty. The flame in the fireplace still dances in the deserted tavern. As he turns to leave, a folded piece of paper on the bar catches his eye. He walks over to grab the paper, unfolding it to read the letters elegantly written. Till next time, my dear hunter. My, you haven't aged a day. The words weigh heavy on him. The bartender did not look familiar. He reads it again in hopes of a clue springing out from his distant memory. Alas, nothing. He crumples the paper and tosses it into the fire. Heading out of the saloon, he meets up with Rin and Enya. They find a small wagon to tie to the motorcycle, allowing the father and daughter a seat on the way home. The wagon is fastened and the two climb in. Rod straddles the bike and starts the engine. He looks back, taking one last glance at the new ghost town the two men created, questioning if there was something they could have done to save the people of Ain. Their existence is now lost to the ever-moving sands of time.